All right, let's dive in. Today, we're tackling something pretty big, a proposed peace formula for the conflict in Ukraine. A conflict, by the way, with some deep historical roots that's pulled in players on the world stage, but
Yeah, you really hit it there. When you mentioned the global players, it's gotten so complex.
absolutely. But before we get lost in the weeds, we got to remember the human cost. And that's where this peace formula really shines a light.
You're absolutely right. The document called Formula for Peace in Ukraine, written by, let me get his name right, Parmendra Kumar Bhagat, he really emphasizes that human cost, the thousands who have died, and gosh, over 1.5 million people displaced just within Ukraine. He's arguing that a ceasefire isn't just, some political game, but a true humanitarian necessity.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's easy to lose sight of the individuals when you're looking at the big geopolitical picture, but these are real people whose lives have been completely upended. And, the document itself doesn't shy away from how complicated this all is. It acknowledges that previous attempts, diplomacy, they haven't worked.
Right, and you think about the Minsk agreements, for example, and the Normandy format talks, they were both trying to stop the fighting, especially in the east of Ukraine, but lasting peace. No way.
Yeah, and why is that? Why have those efforts failed?
Well, it's like, imagine you're trying to solve this puzzle, but the pieces just keep changing shape. There's so much distrust, and everyone wants something different, conflicting goals, you could say.
Mm-hmm.
So when you look at Pagat's formula, it's like, okay, maybe this is a new angle.
All right, so let's dig into this formula. The UN, they seem to play a pretty central role here, right?
Totally. The very first step he lays out is a ceasefire. But not just any ceasefire, one that's monitored by, get this, UN peacekeepers. It's like you
Wow.
bring the refs to make sure everyone's playing by the rules.
Interesting. So is this like a totally new idea, this whole UN peacekeeping thing?
Not exactly. In fact, Bagat actually points to, uh, let me think, some past UN missions that, worked out pretty well. Like UNEF, that was back in the 50s with the Suez Crisis, and then you've got UNFICIP in Cyprus, which has been going on since like the 60s. So the UN, sure, they're not perfect, but they've shown they can help bring about peace, at least sometimes.
So there's some precedent for this kind of intervention, but here's where this formula takes a pretty bold turn. He actually suggests a UN organized referendum, in those contested territories, where the people living there get to decide their own future, whether they stay part of Ukraine or join Russia. Talk about putting democracy into action.
It is. It is. And this is where, we bump into the whole idea of self-determination. It's like this big principle in international law, this idea that people should get to choose their own political destiny.
Sounds good in theory, but how does that work in practice?
Well, it's not always straightforward, right? You have to consider, like, a country's territorial integrity, too. So you're trying to balance the wishes of individuals with keeping a whole nation stable. It's a real balancing act.
I can see how that could get complicated. And then you've got the whole issue of just, well, doing it logistically, holding a referendum in the middle of a war zone. Think about registering voters, keeping the process safe and fair, bringing in people to observe, international observers. That's a huge task.
Oh, absolutely. It would be a massive undertaking for sure. And then we can't forget about the possible outcomes, right? What if those territories vote to stay with Ukraine? What if they choose Russia? What if it's like a really close call, a split decision? Each outcome has these enormous implications, not just for the region, but potentially for the whole world. It's like a chain reaction, one choice leading to another.
It's pretty mind-boggling to consider all the potential consequences. And the document doesn't stop there. It goes deep into the idea of demilitarization, but it's not just about pulling troops back, right?
Right, it's bigger than that. Bagat's idea is much more broad. It's about complete disarmament, like getting rid of all the weapons and helping those former soldiers get back into regular life. And even, this is interesting, he even talks about providing psychological support to deal with the trauma of war. It's a long game, focused on rebuilding trust and really healing the wounds of this conflict.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It sounds like he's looking at how to prevent the conflict from flaring up again, not just stopping the immediate fighting. But what about those challenges of reintegrating soldiers, especially those who've seen the horrors of war firsthand? That can't be easy, can it?
You're right to bring that up. It's a huge, huge undertaking. We can look at other places where conflicts have ended, Rwanda, Bosnia, for example, and those reintegration efforts, they've run into some serious roadblocks. There's always the possibility of violence erupting again and finding jobs that can be really tough for these folks. And the psychological scars, they can last a long time, even after the fighting has stopped.
So it's not just a matter of handing someone civilian clothes and saying, okay, you're back to normal life now. It's much deeper than that.
Exactly. That's where those support systems, those psychological support systems, are so important. It's about recognizing those invisible wounds that war leaves behind.
Makes sense. And it sounds like to make this work, it would require, well, quite a commitment from the international community, providing resources, expertise. Ukraine can't do this alone. Right.
You nailed it. The success of this whole peace formula hinges on global cooperation. Yeah. Everyone needs to step up and do their part.
So it's like a giant puzzle, right? All these interconnected pieces that need to fit together just right.
That's a great way to put it. And there's one more piece we have to talk about: leadership. Strong, committed leadership from everyone involved. That's where Bhagat really hammers his point home.
He's basically saying, leaders, you need to make this happen. Not just talk about it, actually do it.
Exactly. And that's where international guarantees come in. Think of them as safeguards, like insurance policies, to make sure those promises aren't just empty words. We're talking about ways to monitor what's happening, legal frameworks, even potential consequences, sanctions if those commitments are broken. It's about accountability.
So it's almost like a contract. Everyone's signing on the dotted line saying, I'm in this, I'll do my part.
Yeah, exactly. A contract for peace. And those guarantees become even more important when we consider the history behind this whole conflict.
And you're talking about, well, let's just say it, NATO. You can't really discuss this conflict without addressing the role it plays.
Nope, you can't. NATO expanding eastward. That's been a major point of contention with Russia. They see it as a direct threat, like someone's encroaching on their territory. And then you've got Ukraine wanting the protection that NATO offers. It's a classic security dilemma. One side tries to feel safer, but it makes the other side feel threatened, and it just keeps escalating.
So everyone feels threatened, and those feelings just feed the conflict even more. It's a vicious cycle.
Unfortunately, yeah, that's exactly what it is. And that brings us to probably the most controversial aspect of Bhagat's formula.
Oh, yeah, let's talk about that. He suggests Ukraine makes a promise, a commitment to not join NATO.
Wow, I mean, that's a big one. It could potentially ease some of Russia's worries, but some people are going to ask, does it leave Ukraine vulnerable? Is there enough protection without NATO? That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a trade-off, for sure. And it raises even more questions. What would those alternative security arrangements even look like? Could they offer Ukraine the same level of protection that NATO does? And would Russia actually back down, really de-escalate, if Ukraine made this concession?
Those are some really tough questions. I have a feeling they're going to be central to any serious discussion about whether this peace formula can actually work.
Absolutely. And we can't forget this formula, while it's pretty comprehensive, it's not a magic wand. It's more like a starting point, a framework to get the conversation going. The real work, the heavy lifting that comes in those finer details, those tough conversations and compromises that are going to be needed to move from a plan on paper to a lasting peace. That's where it gets really challenging.
It feels like we've only just scratched the surface of a very complex issue.
You could say that again. But even scratching the surface, we're seeing these layers of history, politics, and real human stories. That's what makes this peace formula so fascinating. It's a bold attempt to deal with not just the fighting itself, but the things that caused the conflict in the first place, the root causes. It's ambitious, to say the least.
So it's not just about ending a war in Ukraine, but about figuring out a way to prevent future wars.
Exactly. And that's what we'll explore further as we keep diving into this fascinating and potentially groundbreaking peace formula. As we keep digging into this, it really makes you wonder if we could take what we've learned here and apply it to other conflicts, conflicts all over the world. Bhagat, he actually makes that argument that Ukraine could, be this model for global peace building.
That's a big claim. But is it too much? Think about it. Are there really universal principles that work everywhere, no matter what the conflict is?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? The formula itself, it stresses that you have to adapt because each conflict is unique, right? It has its own DNA. But the basic elements, things like, okay, we need a ceasefire, we need to demilitarize, we need to figure out what caused this mess in the first place. Those might be applicable in all sorts of situations.
Okay, I see what you're saying, but let's play devil's advocate here just for a minute. Isn't this formula, isn't it a little too specific to Ukraine? That whole thing about NATO and the referendum, those are pretty unique to this particular situation.
Yeah, you're right. Those are very specific. And the document acknowledges that, there will always be things that are unique to a particular place and time. But But it's also pushing us to think differently, to move away from those quick fixes, the Band-Aids, and start thinking about peace building as a long-term project, something that takes time and real effort.
So instead of just putting out fires, we need to figure out why they keep starting in the first place. We need to get at those root causes like poverty, inequality, all the things that can fuel conflict.
That's exactly it. And that's one of the things that I find really interesting about this formula. It goes beyond just stopping the fighting. It's about dealing with the trauma, the divisions that conflict creates in society.
It's like you said before, it's not just treating the symptoms, you've got to heal the wound itself. And I remember reading about the reintegration of ex-combatants and providing that psychological support. It just highlights how crucial it is to have healing, real healing, both for individuals and for the community as a whole.
Absolutely. It's something that traditional peacekeeping efforts often overlook. This formula puts people at the center. It recognizes that peace isn't just about lines on a map. It's about creating a society that's fair, a society where everyone has a chance to thrive, to make a good life for themselves.
I like that. It's a powerful idea. But let's be honest, it's a lot easier said than done, isn't it? We're talking about changing deeply ingrained attitudes and behaviors, things that have been around for generations.
You're not wrong. And the document, it's very honest about the difficulties involved. It emphasizes how crucial it is to have leaders who are committed, who are in it for the long haul. And it talks about international cooperation and this willingness to learn as we go, to adapt to new challenges as they come up.
It's a marathon, not a sprint, right? There are going to be obstacles, things will go wrong. But what the document argues is that the potential rewards, things like lasting peace, stability, a chance for Ukraine to really rebuild, those things make it worth the effort.
And it goes beyond Ukraine. If this formula, if it can achieve even a little bit of success in a place like Ukraine with all its complexities and challenges, then it could teach us some valuable lessons that we can use in other conflicts in other parts of the world. It reminds us that even when things look really dark, even when it feels hopeless, the pursuit of peace, it's always worth it.
That's a good point. Okay, let's shift gears a little bit. I want to talk about the UN, their role in all of this. Vagat seems to see them as, I don't know, a pretty important player, right?
Oh, yeah, he does. For Vagat, the UN is essential to making this whole thing work. I mean,
Yeah.
everything from monitoring that ceasefire to organizing the referendum to those security guarantees we talked about, they're the ones at the heart of it all.
And it's not just about, soldiers on the ground. He also talks about the UN's role in facilitating those political discussions, helping people reconcile with each other, and of course, providing humanitarian assistance.
Right, right. It's about recognizing that peacekeeping, it's not just a military operation. It's about creating this whole framework, this system for peace that includes political, social, and economic dimensions. It's got to be comprehensive.
Okay, but I have to bring this up. I mean, we can't ignore the UN's past, right? Rwanda, Srebrenica, they haven't always been successful. So can we really trust them to pull this off?
You bring up a really, really valid point. The UN has had its share of failures, and the document acknowledges that. But what it argues is that they've learned from those mistakes, that they're constantly trying to improve, to become more effective, more accountable.
So it's like giving them another chance, a chance to prove that they can be that force for good in the world. Maybe this formula, maybe it could be the thing that helps them do that.
It's definitely a possibility. But it depends on a few things. You need strong leadership within the UN, people who are committed to making real changes. And they have to be willing to work together with everyone, including the local communities.
And speaking of local communities, the document really emphasizes their role in peace building, right? It's not just about some solution imposed from the outside.
You got it. Fagat argues that for peace to last, it has to come from within, from the people who live there. He talks about involving those communities in the referendum process, supporting their efforts at reconciliation, and empowering local leaders to be those agents of change, the people who make things happen on the ground.
It takes a village, right? You can't just force peace on people. It has to grow organically from the ground up.
Precisely. And that means really listening to the people who've been most affected by the conflict, understanding what they need, what their concerns are, and giving them a real say in shaping their own future.
This has been incredibly thought-provoking. As we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what are your main takeaways? What gives you the most hope about this peace formula?
For me, it's that emphasis on a holistic approach, the idea that it's not just about stopping the fighting, but it's about those root causes, rebuilding trust and creating a society that's more just, more equitable. It's about seeing the bigger picture.
I agree. It's about recognizing that peace, true peace, it's not just the absence of war, it's the presence of justice, of equality, of opportunity for everyone, and that's definitely something worth fighting for.
I couldn't agree more. And while this formula, I mean, let's face it, it's ambitious and there's no guarantee it'll work, it does offer, well, a glimmer of hope.
Hmm.
A hope that Ukraine can heal, that it can thrive, and that what we learn there, those lessons, maybe, just maybe, they can help us find a way to create a more peaceful world.
Wow, I mean, we've really gone deep on this one, haven't we? This document, it paints a picture, shows a way forward, but there's no denying it. It's full of challenges. Makes you wonder, is it, I don't know, is it too ambitious? Can something like this really work out there in the real world?
Yeah, it's definitely a bold idea. There's no doubt about that. But when you look at what's happening and how all those other attempts at peace, well, they haven't worked. Maybe bold is what we need. Those incremental approaches, those little steps, they haven't gotten us anywhere. This formula, it tries to like break the cycle,
Oh.
get to those core issues, not just slap a Band-Aid on the problem. It's about digging deep, getting to the root of the conflict.
And that brings us back to you, our listener. What are your thoughts on all of this? What parts of this formula resonate with you? What gives you hope? And what makes you skeptical? What questions are you wrestling with right now?
Because here's the thing that keeps sticking with me. Fagat says that if this formula works, the lessons we learned from Ukraine, they could have a global impact. Just imagine that, this model for dealing with conflict coming out of one of the most difficult situations we've seen in a long time.
It is a pretty amazing thought when you think about it that way. Is this formula, is it too specific, too tailored to Ukraine? Or could we, I don't know, could we adapt it, use it as a blueprint for other conflicts around the world? Could we see like a ripple effect, a wave of peace spreading outward?
We've seen how much damage conflict causes all over the planet. What if there are those core principles, like the ones we've been talking about, that could help us stop violence before it starts? What if this could lead us to a more peaceful world?
Those are big questions, questions we're thinking about for sure. Maybe this deep dive, maybe it's not just about Ukraine, maybe it's about changing the way we think about how to resolve conflicts, period. It's definitely given me a lot to think about.
Me too, me too. And I hope it's done the same for you, our listeners. This peace formula, even if it doesn't work out in the end, it makes us think about the complexities of conflict and wrestle with those possibilities for peace. It reminds us that even in the midst of all the violence, all the division, that pursuit of peace, well, it's a journey worth taking,